Nobody came to save me that day, and the worst part was realizing the person who should have cared the most was standing right there. My name is Emily Hayes, and for a long time I believed I was simply tired. That was the explanation I gave everyone, including myself. Tired from work. Tired from responsibilities. Tired from trying to keep everyone happy. Looking back now, I understand that exhaustion was only the symptom. The real problem was that I had spent years shrinking myself to fit inside a family where my feelings always came last. When I married Nathan Hayes, I thought I was marrying a kind and dependable man. In many ways, he was exactly that. He worked hard, rarely raised his voice, and treated people with respect. What I did not understand was how much influence his mother, Margaret Hayes, still held over every part of his life. Margaret was 70 years old and carried herself with quiet confidence. She was admired by neighbors, respected by relatives, and trusted by everyone who knew her. Whenever she offered advice, people listened. Whenever she expressed an opinion, conversations shifted around it. At first, I admired that about her. I thought I was lucky to have such a strong mother-in-law. Then small things started happening. If I cooked dinner one way, Margaret suggested a better way. If I made plans for the weekend, she had an alternative that seemed more practical. If I shared an idea, she would smile politely before explaining why another approach made more sense. None of it sounded cruel. None of it sounded hostile. That was what made it so difficult to recognize. Every criticism arrived wrapped inside concern. Every dismissal arrived disguised as guidance. Whenever I mentioned feeling uncomfortable, Nathan responded with the same sentence. Mom means well. At first, I accepted that explanation. Then I began hearing it almost every week. Mom means well when she rearranged my kitchen cabinets without asking. Mom means well when she questioned my career decisions. Mom means well when she interrupted conversations to speak for me. Slowly, I stopped defending myself because the outcome never changed. The most painful part was watching Nathan agree with her so effortlessly. Sometimes I would look at him across the dinner table and wait for him to support me. Instead, he would nod along with whatever Margaret had just said. The pattern repeated so often that I eventually stopped expecting anything different. Around that time, my friends started noticing changes in me. I canceled lunches. I avoided phone calls. I smiled less. Carol Bennett, my closest friend, asked whether everything was all right. I told her I was simply overwhelmed. The truth was harder to explain. I felt invisible inside my own life. Every day required emotional energy I no longer had. Every conversation felt like a test I could not pass. Yet I kept telling myself things would improve if I tried harder. If I became more patient, more understanding, more flexible. Then one evening, after another family dinner filled with quiet corrections and polite criticism, I sat alone in my car and stared at my reflection in the windshield. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. For the first time, a frightening thought entered my mind. What if I was not just tired? What if something inside me was finally beginning to break? Over the next several weeks, the feeling that something was wrong followed me everywhere. I carried it into meetings at work. I carried it into grocery stores. I carried it into bed every night. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the weight remained. What frightened me most was how normal everything looked from the outside. If someone visited our home, they would have seen a successful family enjoying dinner together. They would have seen a caring mother, a hardworking husband, and a wife who smiled politely through every conversation. They would never have guessed how exhausted I felt. Around that time, Carol Bennett started calling more often. At first, I assumed she was simply checking in. Then I realized she was worried. One afternoon, we met for lunch at a small cafe near my office. The moment I sat down, she studied my face for several seconds. Before I could even ask how she was doing, she leaned forward and asked if I had been sleeping. I laughed and told her I was fine. The answer sounded unconvincing even to me. Carol did not let the subject go. She pointed out that I looked thinner than usual. She noticed how often I rubbed my temples during conversations. She reminded me that I had canceled 3 social gatherings in the previous month. As she listed those details, I felt strangely exposed. I had become so focused on surviving each day that I stopped noticing how much I had changed. Still, I defended Nathan. I defended Margaret. I explained that work had been stressful. I explained that family obligations had increased. I explained everything except the truth. Carol listened patiently before asking a question that stayed with me long after lunch ended. She asked whether anyone in my house was taking care of me the way I was always taking care of everyone else. I immediately thought of Nathan. Then I hesitated. Not because he was a bad man. Because I could not remember the last time he truly noticed how much I was struggling. Every evening followed the same pattern. Margaret offered opinions. Nathan agreed. I adapted. The routine had become so familiar that nobody seemed to question it anymore. A few days later, I came home after an especially difficult day at work. A project deadline had been moved forward unexpectedly, and I had spent nearly 10 hours dealing with problems that should have taken weeks to solve. By the time I walked through the front door, all I wanted was a quiet evening. Instead, I found Margaret reorganizing part of the kitchen. She immediately began explaining why several things I had arranged needed to be changed. Normally, I would have nodded and helped. That night, I simply stood there listening. Something inside me felt numb. Nathan entered a few minutes later and noticed the tension. For a brief moment, I thought he might finally recognize what was happening. Instead, he smiled and suggested we all relax because nobody meant any harm. Once again, the conversation ended before it truly began. Later that night, as I lay awake staring into the darkness, a realization slowly settled over me. My friends could see I was struggling. Strangers could see I was struggling. The only people who seemed unable to see it were the two people I needed most. And somewhere deep inside, I started wondering how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. As autumn settled over Cincinnati, the house seemed to grow smaller around me. Nothing physically changed. The walls remained in the same place. The furniture stayed exactly where it had always been. Yet every room felt heavier than before. I noticed it most during family dinners. Margaret sat at the head of the table, offering observations about everything from finances to holiday plans. Nobody asked her to lead the conversation. Somehow it happened naturally every single time. Nathan listened carefully and usually agreed. I listened too, but my role felt different. My opinions were welcomed only when they matched what had already been decided. If they differed, the discussion shifted until my perspective quietly disappeared. One Saturday afternoon, I suggested taking a short weekend trip with Nathan. We had not spent meaningful time alone together in months. Before he could respond, Margaret mentioned several reasons it would be better to stay home. There were household projects to complete, family obligations to consider, more practical ways to spend the money. Within minutes, the trip disappeared from the conversation entirely. Nathan did not argue. He simply nodded and moved on. The disappointment stayed with me for days. What hurt was not losing the trip. What hurt was realizing how quickly my wishes became optional. Similar moments happened everywhere. When I considered applying for a leadership position at work, Margaret questioned whether the additional responsibility would create unnecessary stress. Nathan agreed that perhaps waiting another year made sense. When I talked about redecorating part of the house, Margaret suggested preserving tradition. Nathan agreed again. Every decision seemed to follow the same script. Gradually, I stopped sharing ideas altogether. It felt easier than watching them disappear. One evening, Carol called while I was sitting alone on the back patio. The air was cool and the neighborhood was quiet. She asked how things were going. For several seconds, I considered giving my usual answer. Then something unexpected happened. I told her the truth. Not all of it, just enough. I admitted that I felt invisible sometimes. I admitted that I no longer recognized the confident woman I used to be. Carol listened carefully before saying something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said a healthy home should make you feel stronger, not smaller. After we hung up, I sat outside for nearly an hour thinking about those words. Stronger, not smaller. The more I reflected on them, the more uncomfortable I became. Because if I was honest with myself, the house had been making me feel smaller for years. Later that night, Nathan found me sitting alone in the dark living room. He asked whether something was wrong. I looked at him and saw genuine concern in his eyes. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything. Instead, I simply said I was tired. He accepted the answer immediately. As he walked away, I realized something painful. The safest response in our marriage had become silence. And somewhere deep inside, the part of me that still believed things would improve was beginning to disappear. The moment everything finally unraveled arrived on an ordinary Thursday evening. There was nothing dramatic about the day itself. I went to work. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home. From the outside, it looked exactly like hundreds of other days. That was what made it so frightening. I had spent months convincing myself I could handle the pressure if I just worked harder, smiled more, complained less. But something inside me had quietly reached its limit. When I walked through the front door that evening, Margaret was already sitting at the kitchen table reviewing plans for an upcoming family gathering. Within minutes, she began offering suggestions about the food, the guest list, and the schedule. Normally, I would have listened politely. Instead, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me so suddenly that I had to grip the edge of the counter for support. Nathan noticed and asked whether I was feeling all right. Before I could answer, Margaret commented that everyone gets tired sometimes and that staying busy was often the best solution. The words were not cruel. They were probably intended to be helpful. Yet hearing them felt like the final weight added to an already overloaded shelf. I sat down at the table and tried to steady myself. My heart was racing. My thoughts felt tangled. For the first time in my life, I could not force myself to pretend everything was fine. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I remember staring at the tabletop, embarrassed and overwhelmed, while months of frustration came rushing to the surface. I talked about feeling exhausted. I talked about never feeling heard. I talked about constantly adjusting my life around everyone else's expectations. The words poured out faster than I could organize them. Years of disappointment seemed to emerge all at once. The room became silent. Margaret looked surprised. Nathan looked shocked. For one brief moment, I believed something important was finally happening. I believed the people closest to me would understand how much pain I had been carrying. Instead, nobody moved. Nobody came closer. Nobody offered comfort. Margaret sat quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Nathan remained standing several feet away. I kept waiting for him to sit beside me, to hold my hand, to tell me I was not alone. He never did. He simply watched. The realization hurt more than anything I had said aloud. This was the man who promised to stand beside me through difficult moments. Yet when I needed him most, he seemed frozen between concern and inaction. After several minutes, Margaret suggested that everyone calm down and discuss things another time. Nathan immediately agreed. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. I went upstairs alone and closed the bedroom door. Hours later, I sat beside the window staring into the darkness outside. My face was dry by then, but something fundamental had changed. The breakdown itself was painful. What stayed with me was what happened afterward. The silence. The distance. The fact that the person I trusted most had witnessed my lowest moment and chosen not to step forward. And deep down, I knew I would never look at my marriage the same way again. The days following that evening felt strangely quiet. Nobody mentioned what had happened. Nathan behaved as though the conversation had simply been an emotional moment that would eventually pass. Margaret returned to her normal routines. Meals were prepared. Household schedules continued. Family plans moved forward. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Yet I could not stop thinking about the expression on Nathan's face while I sat at the kitchen table falling apart. It was not anger. It was not indifference. If anything, he looked uncomfortable and uncertain. Somehow that made it worse. Because it meant he saw my pain and still chose not to step toward it. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I found myself wandering through parts of the house I rarely visited. The weather had canceled several family plans, leaving everyone indoors. Margaret was reading in the living room. Nathan was watching television. I needed space to think. Eventually, I found myself standing outside the small upstairs study that once belonged to Margaret's late husband, Thomas Hayes. The room had remained mostly untouched since his passing. Shelves lined the walls. Old photographs sat on the desk. The space carried a quiet sense of history. As I looked around, my attention settled on a wooden storage box tucked beneath a bookshelf. Something about it seemed forgotten, almost hidden. Curious, I knelt down and carefully opened it. Inside were old notebooks, letters, financial papers, and personal documents that appeared to belong to Thomas. I had no intention of invading anyone's privacy, but one notebook immediately caught my attention. It contained handwritten observations spanning several years. At first, the entries focused on ordinary family matters: home repairs, holidays, financial planning. Then the tone gradually shifted. Thomas began writing about decision-making inside the family. He described situations where conversations seemed settled before everyone had spoken. He mentioned concerns about people becoming too dependent on a single voice. Several passages felt eerily familiar. My heart began racing as I continued reading. One sentence stood out more than any other. Thomas wrote that preserving peace should never require sacrificing honesty. I stared at those words for several minutes. They reflected everything I had been struggling to understand. For years, I believed the problem was my inability to adapt. Yet Thomas appeared to have noticed similar patterns long before I entered the family. As I continued through the notebook, I discovered references to meetings with a trusted attorney named David Mercer. Thomas occasionally consulted him regarding family matters and estate planning. Several entries suggested Thomas worried about maintaining balance within the family after he was gone. The details were incomplete, but the concerns felt genuine. Suddenly, my experience no longer seemed isolated. The notebook suggested these issues existed long before my marriage began. By the time I closed the journal, evening shadows filled the study. Downstairs, I could hear Nathan and Margaret talking. Their voices drifted through the house exactly as they always had. Yet everything sounded different now. For the first time, I wondered whether my breakdown had not been the beginning of a problem. Perhaps it was the result of one that had existed for years. And somewhere inside Thomas's forgotten papers, I suspected there were still answers waiting to be found. For the next several days, I could think about little else besides Thomas's notebook. Every spare moment found me returning to the study, rereading entries, and searching for connections I might have missed. The more I read, the more I understood that Thomas had been trying to document something carefully. Not a scandal. Not a secret. A pattern. He seemed deeply concerned about the way decisions were made inside the family and the effect those dynamics could have over time. Yet many of his notes ended abruptly, as though he never had the opportunity to finish explaining his thoughts. Unsure what to do next, I called Carol Bennett and asked if she had time to meet. We spent an afternoon walking through a quiet park while fallen leaves drifted across the path. For the first time, I told her everything. My breakdown. Nathan's reaction. The notebook. The references to David Mercer. Carol listened without interruption. When I finished, she stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not surprise. It was recognition. She admitted that for years she had noticed changes in me that worried her. The confident woman she met years earlier seemed to disappear a little more every time we spoke. She said she often wanted to say something but feared I would think she was criticizing my marriage. Then she shared something unexpected. Several years ago, during a community fundraiser, she had briefly met Thomas. Their conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, yet one comment stayed with her. He mentioned that maintaining harmony inside a family sometimes came at the cost of honesty. At the time, she thought he was speaking generally. Now the statement sounded remarkably similar to what I had read in his notebook. Hearing that made the hairs on my arm stand up. The same concerns seemed to appear everywhere I looked. Thomas had written about it. Carol remembered it. I had lived it. The similarities could no longer be ignored. Carol then asked a question that changed my perspective completely. Instead of focusing on Margaret, she asked why Nathan never challenged the situation. At first, I gave the same answers I always had. He loved his mother. He respected her. He wanted to avoid conflict. Then Carol gently pointed out something I had never considered. Avoiding conflict and avoiding responsibility are not always the same thing. Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. That evening, I returned home and sat alone in the study. I opened the notebook again and found a page mentioning David Mercer. Beside his name, Thomas had written a brief note about preserving family balance and ensuring future generations maintained independent judgment. The wording seemed deliberate. I stared at it for several minutes. If anyone could help me understand what Thomas had been trying to preserve, it would probably be David. For months, I had believed my struggle existed only inside my own marriage. Now I was beginning to see something larger. The issues affecting me had roots stretching back years, perhaps decades. As darkness settled outside the study window, I made a decision. The next morning, I would contact David Mercer. Because if Thomas trusted him enough to record his concerns, there was a good chance he held answers that nobody else could provide. David Mercer returned my call 2 days later. His voice sounded calm and professional, but there was a noticeable pause when I mentioned Thomas Hayes. After I explained who I was and why I was calling, he agreed to meet me at his office on the outskirts of Cincinnati. The appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon. During the drive there, I kept wondering whether I was making a mistake. Part of me feared I was turning ordinary family tensions into something larger than they really were. Another part could not ignore the growing list of questions that seemed to point in the same direction. When I arrived, David greeted me warmly and invited me into a small conference room lined with bookshelves and framed certificates. I showed him several pages from Thomas's notebook. The moment he recognized the handwriting, his expression softened. For several seconds, he simply stared at the pages before carefully setting them on the table. What followed was not a dramatic revelation. It was something far more powerful. Confirmation. David explained that Thomas often spoke about the importance of balance inside a family. According to him, Thomas worried that people sometimes confused peace with agreement. He believed healthy relationships required independent voices, even when disagreements occurred. David never accused Margaret of wrongdoing. In fact, he spoke respectfully about her. However, he acknowledged that Thomas occasionally expressed concern that certain family decisions became difficult to challenge once opinions had already formed. As David spoke, I felt the same pattern emerging again. The notebook. Carol's memory. Now David's recollections. Different people. Different years. The same concern. Toward the end of our conversation, David shared something that affected me deeply. Several years before his death, Thomas worried about Nathan. Not because he doubted his son's character. Because he feared Nathan had become too dependent on seeking approval before making important decisions. Thomas hoped maturity and marriage would eventually strengthen his confidence. Hearing those words felt like someone had described my entire relationship in a single sentence. Suddenly, countless moments from the past made sense. The abandoned plans. The deferred decisions. The constant habit of looking toward Margaret before reaching a conclusion. By the time I left David's office, the afternoon sun was beginning to set. I sat in my car for nearly 15 minutes before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel while I stared through the windshield, trying to absorb everything I had learned. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. My breakdown had not happened because I was weak. It had not happened because I was overly sensitive. It happened because I spent years living inside a system where my voice carried less weight than someone else's. That realization changed everything. That evening, I returned home and found Nathan sitting alone in the den. For several moments, I watched him from the doorway. The man I loved looked exactly the same as he always had. Yet I understood him differently now. He was not choosing to hurt me. He was choosing familiarity. The problem was that familiarity had been hurting me for years. I walked into the room and asked if we could talk. Nathan looked up and nodded. Neither of us knew it yet, but the conversation about to happen would determine the future of our marriage. The conversation began quietly. Nathan sat across from me in the den while evening shadows stretched across the room. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke much. I could tell he sensed the seriousness of the moment. The notebook rested on the coffee table between us alongside several pages of notes I had gathered over the previous weeks. Finally, I told him everything. I explained what I found in Thomas's writings. I described my conversations with Carol and David Mercer. Most importantly, I told him how his reaction during my breakdown affected me. I did not accuse him. I did not raise my voice. I simply told the truth. At first, Nathan listened carefully. Several times he nodded. A few times he looked away. When I finished, silence settled over the room. For one brief moment, I felt hopeful. It was the first time in years that I believed we might actually understand each other. Then Nathan spoke. He said he was sorry I felt unsupported. He said he never intended to hurt me. He said he loved me. Hearing those words should have comforted me. Instead, they felt incomplete, because none of them addressed the central issue. I asked him directly whether he believed the concerns described by Thomas had any truth to them. Nathan hesitated. Then he said he thought people were reading too much into old journals and memories. The hope I felt moments earlier began to fade. I asked whether he believed my experiences were real. He assured me they were. Then he immediately explained why Margaret probably never meant any harm. Once again, the conversation shifted away from what happened and toward protecting his mother's intentions. The pattern was so familiar that I could almost predict each sentence before he spoke it. Eventually, I asked the question I had been avoiding for months. If the same situation happened again tomorrow, would he respond differently? Nathan stared at the floor for several seconds. The silence felt endless. Finally, he admitted that he could not imagine challenging his mother the way I seemed to expect. He respected her too much. He trusted her judgment. He believed she always wanted the best for the family. In that moment, everything became clear. Nathan was not choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between two relationships. And when faced with that choice, his loyalty instinctively moved toward the person who had shaped his entire life. A short time later, Margaret entered the room. She immediately sensed the tension. As the conversation expanded, I calmly explained what I had learned and how I felt. Margaret listened carefully. To her credit, she never became angry. She never insulted me. She simply disagreed. She believed her actions had always come from love and responsibility. Perhaps she genuinely believed that. Yet good intentions could not erase the consequences. By the end of the evening, nobody was shouting. Nobody was arguing. Yet the outcome felt undeniable. Nathan stood beside his mother, not physically but emotionally. The choice had finally revealed itself. As I looked around the room, I realized something important. The answer I had been searching for was no longer hidden inside journals, conversations, or old family records. It was sitting right in front of me. And for the first time, I understood exactly what I needed to do next. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. For several minutes, I lay quietly staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The hum of the heating system, the creak of old floorboards, the distant movement of someone preparing coffee downstairs. Everything sounded exactly as it always had. Yet nothing felt the same. The previous evening had removed the last layer of uncertainty. For months, I searched for explanations. I questioned my judgment. I blamed my stress. I wondered whether I was being unfair. Now I finally understood the truth. The problem was never a single conversation, a single disagreement, or even a single person. The problem was that I had spent years trying to build a life in a place where my voice never carried equal weight. Once I accepted that reality, the path forward became surprisingly clear. Later that morning, I began packing. Not out of anger. Not to punish anyone. Simply because I knew what I needed to do. I carefully folded clothes into suitcases and organized important documents into storage boxes. Family photographs. Work files. Personal keepsakes. Each item represented a small piece of myself that I had slowly set aside while trying to fit into someone else's expectations. Around noon, Nathan found me carrying a box toward the guest room. He immediately understood what was happening. The sadness in his eyes was genuine. For a moment, seeing that pain almost changed my mind. Almost. He asked whether we could still fix things. He asked whether I was making a mistake. Then he told me he loved me. I believed him. That was what made everything so difficult. Nathan was not a cruel man. He was not intentionally hurtful. The tragedy was that love without action could not repair years of emotional neglect. I asked him one final question. If another moment like my breakdown happened tomorrow, would he truly choose differently? Nathan opened his mouth to answer. Then he stopped. The silence told me everything I needed to know. Later that afternoon, I spoke privately with Margaret. The conversation remained respectful. She told me she never intended to make me feel small. She insisted she always acted out of love for her family. I believe she meant every word. Yet intention and impact are not always the same. I thanked her for her honesty and wished her well. For the first time, I no longer felt the need to convince anyone of my experience. Their understanding was no longer required for my healing. The next morning, I loaded the final suitcase into my car. The air was cold and the sky glowed with the soft colors of dawn. Nathan stood near the driveway. Margaret remained on the front porch. Neither tried to stop me. Perhaps they understood. Perhaps they did not. By then, it no longer mattered. As I drove away, I expected to feel heartbreak. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For years, I believed strength meant enduring discomfort and staying silent. I finally learned that real strength sometimes means leaving situations that slowly erase who you are. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life one step at a time. I focused on my work. I reconnected with friends. I rediscovered confidence I thought was gone forever. Most importantly, I learned that my value did not depend on anyone else's approval. Looking back now, the hardest day of my life was also the beginning of my freedom. He watched me break. Then I watched myself heal.